If you're thinking about buying an elevated garden bed like this one, or a traditional raised bed, but you can't quite decide which one's for you, this video is what you need to watch. I'll be walking you through all the different considerations about each one to help you make that decision. Let's get into it. Your comfort is probably the most important factor, so let's talk about it first. When using the elevated garden bed, you're always at standing height. The soil is always going to be right about here, so when you're side dressing with granular fertilizer or compost, or when you're transplanting crops in, or when you're direct sowing seeds, or when you're harvesting something, you're always going to be standing up. And there's a lot less fatigue when you do it that way. Now, so far it sounds wonderful to use an elevated planter bed at standing height. But think about what trellises you might want to use. An elevated planter bed like this is probably going to make it pretty difficult to use any type of very tall trellis, like a big arch trellis or a DIY TP trellis for pole beans. I can just imagine trying to harvest pole beans off of a TP trellis up here. I mean, the TP would be all the way up at the ceiling. A shorter trellis, like a tomato cage, would be just fine in something like this. Now, if we move on to a raised bed, the situation might be different or it might be the same, depending on the height of the raised bed that you choose. A lot of Vego Garden raised beds come in a variety of heights. Usually I see 11 inches tall, 17 inches tall, and 32 inches tall. A 32-inch tall raised bed is approximately standing height. It's about this same height right here. So you could have the same positive aspects of standing up next to your raised bed and the same negative concerns about using a really tall trellis. But when we think about the other heights of a raised bed, the 17 inches and the 11 inches, those are relatively close to the ground. So when you're transplanting, you're direct sowing crops, you're filling the bed up, all of those things are going to require you to bend over, lean over the raised bed, and potentially sit on your knees for a little while working in the raised bed. I know I have certainly experienced some lower back pain by reaching over after a long day of transplanting, and it really can wear you down. And in some cases, you might be kneeling on the ground and leaning over, and when you're kneeling on the ground, you could be hurting your knees depending on the surface beneath you. My raised beds have mulch in the front, so I have to set down either a towel to put my knees on or a kneeling pad to make that comfortable. Now let's move on to the next factor in making this decision, and it's planting depth. The planting depth is where the biggest growing differences come into play. In an elevated garden bed, there's a bottom, and it's more or less sealed off, and so the roots have a hard stop at a 12-inch planting depth. This is great for herbs and leafy greens, but for something like a tomato, you're really going to want to choose a determinate or a compact or a dwarf variety and not an indeterminate type. An indeterminate type tomato will just grow and grow and grow, as will the roots, and it really needs a lot more planting depth. It's a similar concept when talking about beans. You could still grow beans in here, although I would choose bush beans instead of pole beans, mainly because it would be difficult to support the pole beans. Pole bean vines will get 15 to 20 feet long, and it would be tricky to support them when you're already at standing height. You could still grow a root vegetable in here, but one of the biggest things to think about is the type of carrot that you might want to grow. Some carrots are long and slender, and they really have a long taproot that could go deep into the soil. In something like this, you don't want to stunt the taproot, so I would choose a stubby variety of carrot. Now if we move on to a raised bed, there's usually no hard stop at the bottom, assuming you're putting it on the ground. Ideally, you are maintaining a great soil environment in the raised bed, full of nutrition, full of microbial activity, and well supportive of large fruiting crops, even your squash and your cucumbers and your indeterminate tomatoes. Really big and even really deep root vegetables like a daikon radish or a long and slender carrot. Watering and drainage is the next most important factor, and the two different growing systems behave differently in this way. An elevated garden bed like this one is mostly a closed system, although it is not watertight. This system will hold on to water more than a raised bed because it's not allowed to drain quite as freely. Now, a raised bed that has no bottom is free to drain all the excess water. The elevated garden bed is also more of a mobile system. You'll see it often with wheels on it, and you'll see it often put on patio spaces. That's going to make it a little bit more difficult to use drip irrigation. So the watering system that I chose to go with in here was an Oya. But since I mentioned it's not watertight, I have noticed some leakage that comes out when I water the top, or even when I just fill up the Oyas, I'll see some leakage out of the bottom of the elevated planter. And that might cause a bit of a mess, but as long as you put it on a surface where you're okay with spraying it off, it's going to be just fine. In a raised bed, it's much more common to see that set up with a drip irrigation system that's set on an automated timer. And that's a real advantage, especially if you're looking at a larger scale garden. And since the raised bed is on the ground, what I've done is routed the irrigation on the inside of the raised bed, so I maintain that nice look on the outside of the raised bed. You don't see any drip lines, and I can bury the emitter lines in the mulch. It's really a nice, automated, and invisible solution if you do it right. When it comes to soil, there's a few different things to think about, so let's talk about the soil volume and the cost first. This is a 12-inch planting depth and would require about the same soil volume as an 11-inch raised bed, give or take. But in comparison to a 17-inch or a 32-inch tall raised bed, this requires far less soil. So your soil cost is probably going to be less in something like the elevated garden bed than it is in a raised bed. There are some unique ways to save money on the cost of soil in a raised bed. You might have heard of the hugelkultur method, where people put logs and other types of yard waste on the bottom and let it decompose over time, leaving only a smaller, like 12-inch planting depth at the top of the raised bed to fill with soil. So depending on your approach, your soil cost and your soil volume could be pretty similar, or it could be much more for a raised bed. The mobility of your garden bed is also something really important to think about. And it depends a lot on how you want to garden. This elevated garden bed is sold with wheels, and I love that. I can move it around wherever I want. I have some patio space, and it's really perfect for that. And so it's close to home. I put my fresh lettuce greens in here. I put herbs in here. So I'll be able to come out when I'm just making a salad for dinner and I'll harvest the lettuces. It's no big deal. I just walked out my front door to do it. A raised bed is generally not mobile. You're putting it in a spot, and it's a pretty more or less permanent spot. I have moved a raised bed before, and I would not wish that on my worst enemy. It was a lot of work digging out that soil, moving the raised bed, and then putting the soil back in. So you have to be a lot more careful about choosing your location for your raised bed. And so if you're unsure of where you might want to put your garden, it might be a good option to start with an elevated garden bed on wheels so that you're not so committed to a space. Even on wheels, this would be pretty difficult to move across grass, but it would be much easier than removing all the soil, moving the raised bed, and putting all the soil back in to change the spot. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching, guys.